Elijah tightened his scarf as the icy wind gnawed at his skin. The streets of the old quarter were nearly deserted, the fading light casting long shadows against the crumbling facades of antique shops and forgotten cafes. His footsteps echoed as he passed darkened windows, their interiors cloaked in dust and time. He wasn't sure why he had ventured into this part of the city. After weeks of rejection letters and failed auditions, his mind felt like a violin string stretched too tight, ready to snap. His dream of joining a prestigious orchestra seemed to be slipping further out of reach, leaving a hollow ache in its place. It was then that he saw it, a small, unassuming shop squeezed between two boarded-up buildings. Its sign, The Collector's Den, hung crookedly above the door, and the dim interior flickered with candlelight. Elijah hesitated, then pushed the door open with a faint jingle of the bell. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of old leather and varnish. Rows of dusty shelves groaned under the weight of ancient tomes, tarnished instruments, and forgotten artifacts. Elijah's gaze drifted over the clutter until something caught his eye, a stack of sheet music resting on a mahogany stand. Looking for something special, a voice rasped behind him. Elijah turned to see an elderly shopkeeper, his eyes sharp despite his hunched frame. "I'm just browsing," Elijah replied, though his fingers had already begun to sift through the music. One piece stood out immediately. Its cover was worn, the title barely legible, The Devil Sonata. Beneath the title, the name of the composer was smeared, as though deliberately obscured. Elijah's curiosity flared. "That one's not for the faint of heart," the shopkeeper warned. "The composer, if you believe the stories, made a deal with the devil to create it. Every musician who's played it didn't end well." Elijah smirked. "You don't believe that, do you?" The shopkeeper's expression darkened. "You'd be wise not to find out." But Elijah had already made up his mind. He handed over the money and left with the manuscript tucked under his arm, the shopkeeper's warnings echoing faintly in his mind. Elijah placed the manuscript on his cluttered desk, the dim glow of a single lamp illuminating the intricate notes on the page. Despite its age, the music was pristine, the notation flowing like a work of art. Something about it drew him in, a promise, a challenge, a whisper he couldn't quite decipher. He picked up his violin, its varnished surface gleaming under the light, and positioned the bow. A shiver ran down his spine as he began to play the opening notes. The melody unfurled with an eerie beauty. Each stroke of the bow felt as though it were carving into the air itself, filling the room with a sound both haunting and exquisite. Elijah's fingers moved instinctively, as if guided by an unseen force. But as the final note resonated, the room grew unnaturally quiet. The faint hum of the city outside seemed to vanish, leaving only silence. A shadow flickered in the corner of his eye, but when he turned, there was nothing there. He set the violin down, his heart pounding. It was just a trick of the light, he told himself. Yet the sensation lingered, that he was no longer alone. Shaking off his unease, he leaned over the manuscript again. The notes on the page seemed darker, sharper, as if they had deepened in the lamplight. He blinked and rubbed his eyes, blaming his exhaustion. Despite his nerves, a thrill coursed through him. The music was unlike anything he had ever played. Surely, this was the piece that would finally make his career. The next evening, Elijah debuted the sonata at a modest recital. The small audience was entranced. When he played the final note, the room erupted in applause, more enthusiastic than anything he had received in years. But something felt wrong. As he bowed, he noticed a woman in the front row staring, her face pale and eyes wide with something that wasn't admiration. "Elijah," she murmured as he passed her. What was that sound behind the music? He brushed it off with a polite smile, but her words stuck with him. Backstage, the shadows seemed darker, the air heavier. That night, he dreamed of a swirling void filled with whispers. They spoke in a language he didn't understand, yet their meaning was clear. Play again. When he woke, his hands trembled with both fear and anticipation. By the time Elijah returned to his practice room, the pull of the sonata was irresistible. He played with a feverish intensity, the notes consuming him. Then the whisper became a voice. "Well done, Elijah," it said, low and smooth. He froze, the bow quivering in his grip. The shadows in the room coalesced, forming a figure that seemed to absorb the light. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers. What are you?" Elijah stammered. The figure smiled, its teeth impossibly white. "A patron of the arts. Call me the benefactor." "What do you want?" "Nothing you haven't already given," it said, gesturing toward the violin. "That sonata, it's mine. And now, so are its gifts. Fame, fortune, everything you've longed for." Elijah's fear began to fade, replaced by a gnawing desire. "And what's the price?" The figure chuckled. "Price? Consider it a partnership. Keep playing, and the world will adore you." Elijah hesitated, but the weight of failure bore down on him. He nodded. "I'll do it." The figure vanished, leaving behind a lingering chill. The manuscript glowed faintly, the notes pulsing like a heartbeat. Success came swiftly. Within weeks, Elijah was performing to sold-out halls. His name splashed across headlines. Critics praised his brilliance, calling his performances otherworldly. But the costs were becoming evident. During one concert, a woman fainted mid-performance. Another time, Elijah noticed an audience member sobbing uncontrollably, their face contorted in anguish. In the mirror, his reflection seemed distorted, his eyes darker, his face gaunt, his hands ached constantly, the skin cracking as though his very essence were being drained. Still, he played on. The applause, the fame, the validation. They were everything he had ever wanted. He convinced himself the strange occurrences were coincidence, that the price was worth paying. But deep down, he knew the truth. The whispers in the shadows had grown louder, more insistent, demanding his devotion. "Elijah, you have to stop." It was Sarah, his oldest friend, bursting into his dressing room after a performance. She held a stack of papers, her expression a mix of fear and anger. "I've been researching that sonata. Do you know how many musicians have played it, and how many survived?" Elijah scoffed. "Sarah, I'm fine. Look at me. I'm finally successful." "No, you're not fine," she snapped. "You're destroying yourself. This thing, it's cursed." He turned away, unwilling to hear her. The demon's voice echoed in his mind, urging him to push her aside. "She's jealous," it purred. "She wants to take this from you." Elijah clenched his fists. "You don't understand," he said coldly. "This is my chance." Sarah's voice broke. "Elijah, please. Don't let it take you." But he didn't respond as she walked away, her footsteps heavy with defeat. The grand hall was packed for Elijah's most important performance yet. The air buzzed with anticipation as he took the stage, the manuscript resting before him like a sacred text. As he began to play, the demon's presence surged, the shadows thickening around him. The audience sat in eerie silence, their faces slack with rapture. Elijah's bow moved faster, the notes driving him to the brink. He could feel the demon materializing, its form flickering at the edges of his vision. "Complete the piece," the voice commanded, "and I will give you everything." But as the final notes approached, Elijah's resolve faltered. He saw the audience, their eyes glassy and lifeless, and realized the truth. Finishing the sonata would unleash the demon fully, consuming them all. Tears streamed down his face as he made his decision. Instead of finishing the piece, Elijah began to improvise. The music twisted and warped, fighting against the sonata's dark pull. The demon roared in fury, its form rippling with rage. "You dare defy me?" The music surged, dissonant and raw, as Elijah poured his soul into the strings. The manuscript burst into flames, and the demon's scream filled the hall before it vanished in a blinding flash. When the smoke cleared, Elijah collapsed. His hands were trembling, his fingers stiff and unresponsive. He knew, with crushing certainty, that he would never play again. Weeks later, Elijah sat by the river, staring at the charred remains of the manuscript. He had given up everything, his music, his dream, to stop the demon. But as he threw the ashes into the water, a faint melody drifted on the breeze. His heart froze. Somewhere in the distance, someone was playing the Devil's Sonata. The village square was quiet that morning, as it often was. Thick mist hung low over the cobblestones, muffling the sounds of wagons and footsteps. Abigail lingered near the edge of the market, her wicker basket filled with herbs and tinctures from her garden. She was a familiar sight to the villagers, who nodded respectfully but rarely stopped to speak. Her presence commanded a wary respect. As the village healer, Abigail knew their secrets, their illnesses, their fears, their sins. It was her duty to tend to their wounds, physical and otherwise, but she was not beloved. Superstition clung to her like the mist that now veiled the forest. She was about to leave when a commotion drew her attention. A man strode into the square, his black coat immaculate despite the muddy streets. He moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being watched, and watched he was. The villagers gathered, their chatter hushed as the man climbed the steps of the fountain in the center of the square. His hair was dark and slicked back, his skin pale and flawless. When he smiled, his teeth were unnaturally white, his expression polished and reassuring. "Good people of this village," he began, his voice deep and smooth, "I bring you a gift. Salvation." Abigail froze, her basket pressing into her side. The man's words, so carefully chosen, rippled through the crowd. She could see it in their faces. Hope mingled with desperation. "I have been blessed with the ability to cleanse your souls," he continued. "The burdens of sin weigh heavy on the heart, but I can take that weight from you." Gasps and murmurs swept through the crowd. Abigail's jaw tightened. She had heard promises like these before, always from charlatans preying on desperation. But there was something different about this man. As he descended the steps, villagers rushed to meet him, their hands clasped in supplication. Abigail lingered, watching as he placed a hand on the shoulder of an elderly farmer, whispering words she couldn't hear. The man smiled again, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. For the briefest moment, his eyes met Abigail's. A chill ran through her, though she couldn't say why. When she finally turned to leave, she carried more than herbs in her basket. She carried unease. The following morning, the village buzzed with talk of the stranger. Many had already sought his absolution, and those who had claimed to feel lighter, freer. Abigail remained skeptical. That night, she sat at her workbench, grinding herbs for a poultice, but her thoughts lingered on the man's promises. Her unease deepened when the news spread. Edward, the farmer the stranger had touched in the square, was dead. She visited his home at the edge of the village, where Edward's wife wept by the hearth. Abigail examined the body, her practiced hands searching for signs of disease or injury. His skin was pale and drawn tight over his bones, as if something had drained him from within. "What happened?" Abigail asked, her voice low. He said he felt so much lighter after the ritual," Edward's wife stammered, "like he'd been freed. Then, this morning, he wouldn't wake." Abigail's stomach twisted. Did the stranger return? The woman shook her head. "No," he said once the ritual was done, Edward's sins were gone forever. Outside, the mist seemed to press closer to the village. Abigail walked home quickly, clutching her basket. She didn't know what the stranger was, but she was certain he wasn't here to help. By the third day, the rituals had become routine. Villagers lined up in the square, their faces etched with guilt and longing. The stranger spoke to each one in turn, laying his hands on their shoulders as they whispered their sins. Abigail stood at the edge of the crowd watching. The stranger's movements were deliberate, almost theatrical, but there was a precision to them that unsettled her. That night, she resolved to find out more. She hid in the shadows of a nearby barn, close enough to observe, but far enough to remain unseen. The ritual began as usual. A woman knelt before the stranger, her hands trembling as she confessed. Abigail strained to hear the words, but the stranger's voice was low, almost a growl. As the woman rose, Abigail saw it, a flicker of something in the stranger's shadow. It moved independently of his body, stretching and curling like a living thing. Her breath caught as she noticed his hands. For a brief moment, they seemed impossibly long, the fingers claw-like. When the ritual ended, the woman walked away, her face serene. Abigail lingered, her pulse pounding. She couldn't prove what she had seen, but she knew one thing. This was no ordinary man. The stranger remained in the square, his shadow looming large as the last of the villagers left. Abigail's unease solidified into certainty. She had to confront him. The next morning, Abigail waited for the stranger in the square. The villagers gathered as usual, but this time, Abigail stepped forward. "You're not what you claim to be," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The crowd fell silent. The stranger turned to face her, his smile as sharp as a knife. "I don't know what you mean, healer. I only wish to help." "You're feeding on them," she accused. "Edward is dead. How many more will die before they see what you are?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but the stranger raised a hand, silencing them. "I offer salvation, nothing more," he said. "But what do you offer, Abigail?" "Painkillers and poultices. Can you cleanse their souls?" The villagers shifted uncomfortably. Abigail could see doubt creeping into their eyes. The stranger stepped closer, his voice dropping. "You fear what you don't understand, but they don't have to. They've seen the truth." His words turned the crowd against her. "Maybe you're jealous," someone muttered. Abigail swallowed hard, backing away as the villagers closed ranks around the stranger. She had lost this battle, but she wouldn't stop fighting. That night, Abigail crept into the inn where the stranger was staying. The door to his room was unlocked, and the faint smell of sulfur hung in the air. The room was sparse, but on the desk lay a leather-bound journal. Abigail flipped through it, her breath catching as she read. The entries described rituals in other villages, each ending with the same line: "Their sins are mine, and their lives are forfeit." Before she could react, the door creaked open. The stranger stepped inside, his smile gone. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and menacing. Abigail backed toward the window, clutching the journal. "You're a demon," she whispered. The stranger tilted his head. "That's such an ugly word. I prefer Sin Eater." He stepped closer, his shadow darkening the room. "You figured me out. Congratulations. But it changes nothing. These people will give me what I need, willingly." "You're killing them," Abigail snapped. "And what of it? Their sins would have destroyed them anyway. I offer release." He smiled again, this time without pretense. "I could offer you something too, Abigail. Power, protection, even resurrection." Her breath caught as he said the last word. "I can bring them back, your family. Just say yes." For a moment, she hesitated. Then she bolted, the journal clutched to her chest. The forest was silent as Abigail prepared the ritual. She had spent the night poring over her books, searching for a way to bind the demon. The answer lay in the very sins he consumed. The villagers would never help her, so she carried her own sin, a secret she had buried for years. She only hoped it would be enough. The blood moon cast an eerie glow over the clearing as she scattered the salt circle and lit the candles. The demon appeared, his form shifting and grotesque under the crimson light. "Abigail," he purred, "I hoped you'd see reason. Have you reconsidered my offer?" She stepped into the circle, clutching a blade. "I've come to end this." The demon laughed, his voice echoing through the trees. "You can't end me, healer. You're just as tainted as they are." Abigail raised the blade, her voice steady. "I know, and that's why this will work." She whispered the incantation, the words foreign and sharp. The demon lunged, but the circle flared, trapping him. His roars shook the ground as the ritual reached its peak. Abigail clenched her fists, her sin burning in her mind. The candles extinguished, and the forest fell silent. When Abigail opened her eyes, the demon was gone. The clearing was empty, save for the smoldering remnants of the ritual. Her body felt heavy, her limbs weak. She stumbled back toward the village, but the faces that greeted her were filled with fear. "You're cursed," one villager spat. "You've brought this on us." Abigail said nothing. She couldn't. The scars from the ritual ran deep, both inside and out. She turned away, knowing she could no longer stay. As she walked into the forest, the village disappeared behind her. The weight of her sacrifice pressed on her chest, but she told herself it was worth it. Then she heard it, a faint whisper on the wind. "You've cleansed nothing," it said. "They're mine now." Abigail froze, her heart pounding. She knew the demon was bound, but his influence remained. The villagers had let him in, and she couldn't take that back. With a heavy heart, she disappeared into the trees, knowing her fight was far from over. The attic smelled of dust and mildew, a stale heaviness that clung to the air. Alex pushed open the creaking door, a flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the chaos of forgotten belongings. Stacks of yellowed newspapers, tarnished picture frames, and boxes spilling over with trinkets no one had thought to sort through in decades. Their late grandfather had been a hoarder of curiosities, and it showed. Alex sighed, pulling their hoodie tighter against the attic's chill. Sorting through the mess was supposed to bring closure, but so far, it only made them feel more isolated. "Why couldn't you just let go of things?" Alex muttered under their breath, nudging a stack of boxes aside. The flashlight flickered, catching a gleam of brass. Alex turned, intrigued, and found a clock tucked beneath a faded quilt. It was unlike anything they had ever seen, ornate, almost regal, with an intricate design carved into the brass frame. Strange symbols twisted and curved along its surface, and the face of the clock was made of dark, polished glass. As Alex lifted the clock, they noticed its surprising weight, as though it held something alive inside. A chill prickled their skin. "Creepy," they murmured, brushing off the feeling. But something about the clock captivated them. It felt purposeful, as if it had been waiting for them to find it. They carried it downstairs, setting it carefully on their dining table. It didn't tick, but its hands were frozen at a peculiar time, 11:57. Alex tilted their head. 3 minutes to midnight. Shrugging off the unease, they decided it was just an interesting antique. That night, Alex sat at their desk sketching, the clock now occupying a spot on a nearby shelf. Its ornate design had lingered in their thoughts all evening, pulling their gaze toward it. Despite its silence, the clock seemed to radiate a subtle presence, like it was observing them. Alex shook off the thought. They leaned over their sketchpad, charcoal smudging their fingers, and lost track of time. The chime came suddenly, slicing through the quiet like a blade. Alex jumped, the charcoal snapping in their grip. Turning to the clock, they stared in disbelief. Its hands had moved. They now pointed to midnight, and the chime echoed through the room again, low and resonant. Before Alex could react, the room stilled. The sound of the ticking clock was the only thing that remained, a metronome in the unnatural silence. "Alex," a voice whispered. They froze, their breath catching. The voice was deep, smooth, and came not from the room, but from within their own head. "Do you want to fix it?" the voice asked. Alex glanced around, heart pounding. "Fix what?" The clock's glass face glowed faintly. "Your debt. Your failures. The world has been unkind to you. I can make it fair." They hesitated, a cold sweat forming on their brow. "What do you want in return?" "Nothing you'll miss," the voice replied, soothing and confident. Alex thought of their overdue bills, the rejection letters piled on the counter, the friends who no longer returned calls. What could they lose that hadn't already been taken? "Fine," Alex whispered. "Do it." The ticking grew louder, faster, and suddenly the world rushed back into motion. The silence was gone. The chime faded. Alex gasped, clutching the desk as a strange sense of relief settled over them. When they checked their phone the next morning, an email waited in their inbox, an offer for an art commission that would cover their rent for the month. The days that followed felt almost too good to be true. The commission led to another, then another, and Alex began to think the clock's promise had been harmless. But the chimes continued, irregular and unpredictable, each time freezing the world around them. "Another problem solved," the voice said during the second chime, offering to cut short a bitter argument with a former friend. Alex agreed, and when time resumed, the friend left without another word. By the third chime, the favors grew darker. You could stop him, the voice whispered one evening as Alex watched a neighbor berate a delivery driver in the street. It would be so simple. What does that mean? Alex asked aloud, their voice shaky. The clock didn't answer directly, but when Alex hesitated, a vision of the neighbor falling and breaking his ankle flickered through their mind like a dream. The next time the clock chimed, Alex didn't hesitate. They agreed to the favor, and the neighbor was confined to his home for weeks. At first, the benefits seemed worth the strange occurrences. Fewer arguments, less struggle. But the favors began to demand more. A severed friendship here, a public humiliation there. Each time, Alex felt the clock's influence tighten, its ticking growing louder in their ears even when it was silent. They told themselves they could stop any time. They were still in control. It wasn't until Alex woke up one morning and couldn't remember the day before that they realized something was wrong. The calendar on their phone read Thursday, but Alex was sure it had been Tuesday just hours ago. Their sketchpad was filled with drawings they didn't remember starting, much less finishing. The clock sat on the shelf, its hand spinning erratically before stopping at 3:15. "What did you do?" Alex demanded, glaring at the clock. "You asked for help," the voice replied calmly. "And I delivered. Is that not enough?" Panic clawed at Alex's chest. They hadn't asked for this. They wanted to throw the clock out, smash it to pieces. But when they approached it, their hands trembled. Instead, they dug deeper. Pulling the clock from the shelf, they examined its symbols, their shapes strangely familiar now. A memory surfaced, an old story their grandfather had told them as a child about a cursed clock that could bend time at the cost of a soul. "Is that what you are?" Alex whispered. "A demon." The voice laughed softly. "I'm an opportunity, Alex. A chance to claim what you deserve." The ticking filled the room, growing louder, more insistent. Alex dropped the clock and stumbled back. That night, they called an old friend, someone they hadn't spoken to in years. They tried to explain, but their words came out jumbled and frantic. The friend dismissed them, their voice distant. When Alex hung up, the clock chimed again. "Let me fix it," the voice urged. "One favor. It's all it takes." By now, Alex could feel the clock's influence in every corner of their life. They had begun to avoid people altogether, afraid of what the next favor might demand. But the clock was relentless. One night, as Alex sat staring at the clock's unmoving hands, it spoke again. "There's only one thing left," it said. "Someone close to you. Someone who trusts you. Betray them, and your life will be yours forever." "No," Alex said, their voice hoarse. "I won't do it." The ticking grew louder, reverberating through the room. Shadows stretched along the walls, pooling at Alex's feet. "You've already come this far," the voice snarled. "You think you can walk away now?" Alex grabbed the clock, their hands trembling. "You don't control me." The clock's glass face glowed brightly, and the room seemed to fold in on itself. A dark figure emerged from the clock, its form shifting and amorphous, with glowing red eyes that pierced the darkness. "I am time itself," the demon hissed. "And I own you." The confrontation that followed was a blur of chaos. Alex tried to smash the clock, but the demon lashed out, forcing them to confront the consequences of their choices. Visions of the people they had hurt flashed before their eyes, each one more painful than the last. "Your life or theirs," the demon roared. "Choose." With a desperate cry, Alex raised the clock and brought it crashing down. The clock shattered into 1,000 pieces, the demon screamed dissolving into silence. Alex collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. When they opened their eyes, the room was eerily quiet. The clock was gone, but so was everything it had given them. The commissions, the repaired relationships. They had all been reset, leaving Alex right where they had started. Alone. Weeks passed, and Alex tried to rebuild their life. They reached out to old friends, but their calls went unanswered. The scars of their choices lingered, invisible but ever present. One night, as Alex sat in their quiet apartment, they thought they heard it, the faint ticking of a clock. They turned toward the sound, their breath catching in their throat. but the room was empty. For now,